Adventure sports are associated with high levels of risk. They involve extreme height, speed, and danger. These activities require intense training, maximum physical shape, and specialized equipment. For adventure enthusiasts, it's a way of life. They live for the rush of adrenaline and the thrill these sports offer. One of these adventure enthusiasts was, believe it or not, a 66-year-old woman named Geraldine Largay. But don't they say age is just a number? And rightly so, because Geraldine has gone on a hike on the Appalachian Trail. Although this path is known to be difficult and challenging for even a young and adjusted person, Geraldine was convinced that she could finish it successfully. Little did she know her trip will be very different from what she had planned. And 2 years after this expedition, her family will finally discover the truth. The Appalachian or AT Trail is a traced hiking trail in the eastern United States, spread over 2,190 miles from Springer Mountains in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine. The trail crosses 14 states of the East Coast and is the ideal way to experience the region in its natural glory. For hiking enthusiasts, this trail is one of the most breathtaking experiences in the world. However, it's not a comfortable trip at all. It takes about 5 months to complete this rock track that exposes you to extreme weather conditions. In fact, out of 4,000 hikers on this path every year, only a quarter manage to reach the finish line. The chances of surviving this hiking trail were not great, but for Geraldine or Jerry Largay, it was worth trying. Jerry was a retired nurse living in Tennessee. She loved the outdoors and has always been an adventure enthusiast even at 66 years old. And in the spring of 2013, she was ready for her next adventure. After doing research for this next destination, Jerry was convinced that she had to hike the Appalachian Trail. Jerry had been married to her husband George for nearly 40 years now. They were high school sweethearts and Jerry had never known the love of another man except George. But back in the day, Jerry had a fear: marriage. Her parents never had a happy marriage to look at and she was afraid to follow their tracks. But early enough, George made Jerry realize that he's not like her parents, so she could let go of fear and embrace happiness instead. Her love for George was enough for Jerry to take the leap of faith, and after their marriage, the couple became parents to a beautiful girl. Jerry had finally abandoned the fear and kissed her little family as a source of happiness. As a young couple, Jerry and George were still outdoors and were frequently going on treks and hikes. However, that's not changed even as they grew up. In fact, after retiring, Jerry had more time to travel, which is why she was determined to follow the Appalachian Trail. Jerry had always been a strong, independent woman. However, her anxiety was something she had dealt with all her life. Her husband was always an immense help in getting Jerry's worry under control. But despite that, she decided to make this trip without him. She believed it was an obstacle she needed to overcome alone. George was not aboard with this plan. He wanted to accompany her on the trip for many reasons. As for one, Jerry had a terrible sense of direction and this trail was known to be difficult as is. In addition, it wasn't a question of days but months to finish the track. After endless discussions between the couple, they finally reached a common ground. Jerry accepted after great resistance to bring her best friend, Jane Lee, on this trip with her. Jerry and Jane have been friends since they were little children and she also knew George since they all went to the same high school. She was the perfect person to accompany Jerry on this hike. George had one condition. Although Jerry was not going alone, the ladies were in their 60s and needed additional extra precaution. It was therefore decided that as they took the trail, they would continue to meet George along the road, who would take care of them and would re-examine their supplies. Thus, after countless preparation and discussions, the two women started on their trip on April 23, 2013. They entered the drag through an opening at Harper Ferry in Western Virginia. Jerry had a new burst of energy. She was not sure what it was the trip or walking on foot, but she took advantage of every moment. Jerry and Jane have been exposed to a routine. They would try to cover a maximum distance during the day, leaving the evening to rest and sleep. It was a smart call to avoid hiking in the dark, because Jerry's terrible sense of direction has become even more difficult during the night. In addition, it was easier to locate things in the daylight. Jerry managed to be in constant contact with her husband. She would make at least one phone call every day to tell him that it was going well, and a text too. On one of these calls at home, Jane learned that she had to run home. Jane asked Jerry to come with her. She didn't think Jerry was able to navigate the remaining trail. It was 2 more months of their hike, which meant they weren't even halfway. But Jerry had a different plan. She intended to finish this trip alone and refused to return with Jane. Despite Jane's endless requests, Jerry decided to continue with her solo trip. Jane had abandoned the track a few kilometers into New Hampshire, and from that moment it was just Jerry and her backpack. She kept a travel diary with her to document her journey. Jerry continued hiking over the next few weeks, covering the distance from New Hampshire and reaching Maine, which counted she was almost there, near the finish line. She met with many hikers along the way and everyone admired her bravery. She always mentioned the support she had from her family and how she maintained it. It was the morning of July 24th. George had just finished with breakfast. He had another cup of coffee while his eyes were on the clock. Jerry was supposed to call today and update him on her location. It was now the evening and George was panicking. He was waiting for a phone call from Jerry all day now. It was difficult to forget to call since it was already a routine to stay in touch. If the call couldn't connect, she was supposed to send a message that would automatically send once the cell phone found a network. When the sky fell dark outdoors, George decided he couldn't wait anymore. He decided to ask for help. The next morning, if he managed to get in touch with her, they would simply laugh and call this, well, a story. But for now, he'd go to the front because he couldn't risk risking his family.
911, what's your emergency?
Jerry's last update was she had reached Maine. George has therefore decided to contact the Department of Maine Parks and Leisure and report Jerry is missing. They immediately summoned a search party for her, who would become the biggest target for the state. The search party would come out every day to Maine's wild nature and scan all traces that could report them in Jerry's direction. But a week later, there was still no news from Jerry. To say that George had a broken heart would be an understatement. However, he had no plans to give up. The search parties therefore continued to search and they involved research aircraft, state police, and even the fire departments. Investigators also broadcast flyers with Jerry's photos and description. Witnesses who showed up with information had contradicting stories. A witness claimed to see a woman with Jerry's description walking around a neighboring city, while another witness claimed to spot Jerry at the same time in a women's refuge in Tennessee. The search parties went through the forests of Maine for 20 days, but unfortunately they could not locate Jerry nor any of her property or anything that could lead to her. The investigators were subjected to different stories from several witnesses. They all accepted it was time to call the search. After spending innumerable instant nights to know how to reach his wife, George finally understood he had lost his Jerry forever. With a heavy heart, Jenny and George decided it was time to say goodbye to Jerry. They held a commemorative service with the rest of their family for the beloved woman and the mother later in the year. It was not until 2 years later in October 2015 when investigators finally got answers on Geraldine Lergay, the woman never found. When shooting an episode for a TV show, one of the crews of the Animal Planet cast stumbled upon something strange in the woods. A member of the Animal Planet crew discovered a yellow tent that fell only half a mile from the Appalachian Trail. He supposed it was left by a hiker who could have created a trail camp, but he couldn't have been more wrong. The man suspected something awful, and what he found under the vestiges of the tents was a so-decided corpse that he wasn't sure someone could identify. He immediately called the rest of his crew so they could report it to the police. Once the cops arrived, they started investigating the contents of the tent and found a newspaper stuffed inside. This helped them to identify the corpse as Geraldine Lergay, the woman who disappeared 2 years ago in 2013. The news was heartbreaking for the officers. The officers reached Lergay's residence to transmit the bitter news to George. It was bitter for several reasons. George had already arrived at the loss of Jerry 2 years ago. They assumed the worst and had a commemorative service for her, so bringing that up again would cause immense pain. If people supposed that after 2 years it would not hurt George since he already accepted the loss of his wife, they were wrong. It's a tragedy of losing a loved one. The news struck him like a punch in the gut. The officers left Jerry belonging to George and handed him the newspaper. The front said, "George, please read XOXO." George sat down with the newspaper and opened it with trembling hands. It was her handwriting. She had documented everything: her trip with Jane, her journey after Jane, how she met numerous hikers on the way, and how she fell from the path and couldn't find her journey. Jerry came out of the track to use the toilet, but after wandering in the woods, she couldn't find her way back. She tried to contact her husband immediately, but her phone had lost signal. She could not find a clearing either. She also climbed in hopes of finding a signal at a height, but this effort too, unfortunately, didn't bring any fruit. Jerry did not have a card, no GPS, and her phone had lost a signal. She decided to stay in place and camped in the yellow tent. She waited for help, which never came. Her supplies slowly decreased and she saw no sign of hope. After 26 days of surviving in the woods, she finally passed away in her sleeping bag due to famine and exposure. Jerry's diary also revealed the various efforts she had made to try to escape and survive the entire incident. She tried to make a fire, map the area, made a bed with small trees, pine needles, and dirt to keep the water from her tent. She managed to fight for 26 days, but unfortunately could no longer hold out. The search party for Jerry was called off on August 4, 2013, but unfortunately the journal and newspaper shows that she was still alive as late as the same month. If only things could have been different, they may have found her in the woods. George also discovered her phone among her possessions. Once checking it, he read all the non-delivered texts she sent asking for help. The day she wandered, Jerry sent, "In some trouble, went out to the bathroom, now lost. Can you call AMC to see if a trail manager can help me? Somewhere north from Woods Road, XOX." His eyes blurred with tears as he continued to read them over and over. Jerry's campsite was nearly 1 kilometer or 2 away from the Appalachian Trail, and according to the officers who found her body, the campsite she had built was not visible to the human eye unless you're next door. Forests are thick as is, then finding something like that was really impossible, even for a search plane. The saddest part was the note of the journal to Jerry, which read, "When you find my body, call my husband George and daughter Carrie. It will be the biggest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me, no matter how many years from now. Please find it in your heart to post the contents of this bag to one of them." Even if George and Carrie had a memorial for Geraldine back in 2013, they had not received closure before that moment. Jerry was right. It was the greatest kindness for her family's tormented hearts to know that she is not lost, but dead. Now they can finally be able to know that Jerry's at peace. The reception of the Jerry Journal and tent affairs meant a lot to George and helped introduce the healing process. Even if he lost the love of his life, he had no regrets about Jerry going on hiking. He believes that she died doing what she loved most, living life to the fullest. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider sharing it with someone who may find it interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.